Registration Day. I am Dr. King, and I am presenting my final presentation today on the history of voting. And for those who were not, I couldn't figure out something was going on weird there for a second. But for those, let me start over because the live kind of slowed up on me. Good afternoon. This is Dr. King. This is the final presentation, the 4 o'clock presentation for National Voter Registration Day. For our TI Communities Wide National Voter Registration Day event, I will be discussing the history of voting. Presentation is slated from 4 to 5. It shouldn't be that long. Nothing against the history of voting, but it's not going to take me an hour to discuss it. Matthew just finished his 3 o'clock presentation on the voting regulations. My apologies. For Georgia, Maryland, and Washington at 2 p.m. I did the regulations for Texas, Illinois, and Nevada. These are the 6 states that TI Communities has complexes in. TI Communities has communities in. We don't want to call them apartment complexes. I like that, communities. And so we wanted to give our residents information on what they need to know when they need to register to vote, early voting dates, where they can go, what requirements are need to register, deadline dates, and things of that nature. And then we kicked everything off earlier today with voting 101 and knowing if you are ready to vote, what information do you know? You know, maybe you know too much, maybe you didn't know enough, but Matthew put together awesome presentations today. And I'm here to wrap things up, and I hope mine is just as awesome as well. I'll give you a little bit of information about myself if you were not in the first presentation. I am an 18-year resident of the 800 Link community here in Duncanville, Dallas, which is Texas, which is right outside of Dallas. I am a graduate of Duncanville High School. I've been in Duncanville for 34 years. I'm a wife and a mother. I have a daughter that's a senior in high school this year up at Duncanville, so that's kind of fun. Educationally, I have an associate degree in Associate of Arts and Sciences degree. My apologies, I went blank for a second there. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's in organizational management, and a doctorate in sports management. And I try to use all of those degrees to help me do everything and to do everything to the best of my abilities. Um, I am considered a servant leader, and I've served in various servant leadership roles. Today being one of them, being a resident educator or resident professional for TI communities allows me to be just another servant leadership role for me, and I actually enjoy what I'm doing here. But I'm also a girls basketball coach. I've served on several and various sports boards here in the DFW Metroplex. And, that was just a little bit about me if you weren't at the earlier presentation. And I just wanted you to know who I was, so, you're like, well, who are you, Dr. King? And so that's who Dr. King is. So without further ado, we'll get going on the history of voting. And the history of voting is not vast. It's more of anything more. I don't want to call it anything bad, but it's just been one blight on the history of the country that unfortunately candidates have tried their best and political parties have tried their best to prevent people of color from voting. And unfortunately, that's the reality of the matter. But we're going to start and go forward from the first election and go forward. And the first election was held, and actually was a 25-day election, and was held starting December 15th, 1788 to January 10th, 1789. And George Washington ran unopposed. He became president. John Adams became vice president, and he won 100% of both the popular vote and the electoral college. And the electoral college we'll get in just a little bit later. But George Washington received 43,782 popular votes, and all 69 electoral college votes, which was all there was back then. He only needed 35 to win. He earned all 69. And so he won 100% of both the popular vote and the electoral college vote, and was a 2-term president. Voting itself is part it all became about with the first amendment of the Constitution that gave states, and I want to make sure that I read this correctly. I have so much information here, you guys, and I just don't want to present anything wrong. And it was hard to even try to type this up because it was just so much. And so, I have things highlighted and circled and, things like that. But I just want to make sure that when I present information, I am giving you accurate information, nothing summarized, nothing, paraphrased, the real deal. And so the First Amendment of the Constitution basically gave states the rights to decide how they will vote, gave them, one thing with our founding fathers of this country is that trying to determine who was going to lead this country was kind of out of their realm. And so the Electoral College basically came about. And like I said, this is kind of a little bit, but we're going to go off into the Electoral College later. But the Electoral College was basically founded, and the reason being is because the founding fathers could not come to an agreement on how they would choose a leader for the country. And so I'm not going to go any further there with that, but that's kind of how the whole election thing came about. But the thing with the election is that though some founders wanted Congress to be able to, wanted the government, in other words, not necessarily Congress, but the government to be able to pick the leader. Others were like, the citizens ought to be able to do it. And so the Electoral College was the happy medium. But back then, the primary thing that was going on was slavery. And so there was no equality, there was no, we're going to do this the right way. Unfortunately, it was all of the white Protestant 21 and older males who were slave owners and landowners were basically all your voters. And though there were very, very, very many people of color, not just African Americans or back then Black people, but you had Hispanics, there were Asians, Blacks were not the only slaves in this country. And so none of them were given the right to vote. It was only white Protestant males, 21 or older, who were landowners. So that went on for roughly 76 years. Those were the only ones that'll be able, that could vote. And that's kind of, that's the history. The first 76-year history of voting in this country was only white males, 21 and older, had to be landowners. And it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves on January 1st, 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves were considered free, but the definition and the understanding of what free meant was no, free wasn't free. And so the problem there, even though slaves were free, they really were not. And that came and brought about what is considered the Black Codes. And the Black Codes were literally any and everything that all states, just like everything, every state has their own way of doing things. And the Black Codes were implemented to keep Black slaves from voting, though, freed slaves. They were not slaves anymore. They were free Black people, to prevent them from voting, because there were a bunch of them. And so slave masters, slave owners, however you want to call it, the idea was they wanted, it was the whole Civil War and everything. There was just so much going on there. But when it came to voting, it was, we have these slaves here, and unfortunately, when they were slaves, Black people were not created. We weren't nowhere near created equal, but we were not even considered people. We were property. And so it became an issue of, well, we have all of these slaves and now they're free, can't they vote? And then, Protestant white men, absolutely not. That was the response. So everything was designed to stop the Black people and other people of color from voting. And when I discuss people of color and discuss voting movements and things of that nature, I'm not just talking about Black people. I am discussing anybody who was not white and who was not male, because even when it came to women didn't have the right to vote either, even the white women. So it was, the first 76-year history of this country with voting, like I said, unless you were a white Protestant male, 21 or over and on land, that was just not your thing to do. You could not vote. And even in 1863, when slaves were freed with the Emancipation Proclamation, it was still 2 years later before they were even given the option to vote, because of the Black Codes. And the Black Codes were basically a list of requirements and guidelines, that every state leader could come up with, and it was, they were all just ways of not allowing Black people to vote. It was ways of adding guidelines and requirements, and you know, there were taxes that had to be paid, poll taxes, you know, all of these types of things. You know, you couldn't vote unless you owned property. You couldn't vote unless you were white. You couldn't vote unless you were a certain gender. You know, just there were just all of these things that were on this list of black codes that just wanted to prevent black men, because remember, women weren't even you know, that wasn't even an option then. So all of this thing, all of this black codes and all of this thing, this stuff applied to black men. Freed black male slaves, you know, the black codes were applied to them. But in the 15th Amendment that came about in 1865, gave black men, freed black slaves, the right to vote. However, it was still another year before that even happened, because once again, black codes started 1865, 1866, and they were immediately created and implemented, because there, you know, once Lincoln freed the slaves, there were automatically 4 million free people walking around this country. And so they didn't want them to have voting privileges. So 1865, that was what, not 1861, I'm trying to look at my notes. 1863, they were freed. It was another 2 years before they were given the right to vote, but to actually cast a vote did not even come until 1866. So there was a lot that was going on in that time frame. You know, there, you know, the black codes created so much dissension and so much, we're just going to do everything we can to block you from voting, that it became that, you know, in certain states, you know, black men could only be farmers, or they could only be, you know, workers, servants is what I'm trying to say. And then if you couldn't prove that you were a servant, or if you couldn't prove, you know, election year that you had employment, you know, not only could you not vote, you had to forfeit any wages you had already, you know, earned, because you couldn't prove any kind of way that you were employed. So there was just so much going on during that time. You know, and then we want to fast forward and we'll come on to 1870, which is where things kind of started to get a little bit better. And in 1870, the Constitution eliminated racial barriers to voting. However, many states continue to practice voter discrimination and implement poll taxes and literacy tests. You know, there was so much, you know, once again, if you couldn't pay a tax, you couldn't vote, you know, and then the other thing was, if you couldn't read, if you couldn't write, that's where the literacy test came in. How can you vote if you can't read a ballot? You know, how can you vote if you can't sign your name? You know, things of that nature. So there were so many ways of voter discrimination that was going on. Then, you know, you had voter fraud, and then, just different ways, you know, just blatant intimidation tactics that were being used to prevent people from voting. And even though we discuss people of color, you know, when I say people of color, we're saying brown skin and things of that nature. Though things were kind of getting better for black freed slaves, Native Americans still had no rights. You know, this is their land. So they were still not, you know, given the opportunity to vote, even though freed black slaves had the option to vote, but were being discriminated against from voting. And so, you know, it just became, you know, we can fast forward from there and get to like civil rights movement. You know, there's just over the years, voting has just been that one crux with this country that, once again, when I said in the earlier, you know, if you watch the earlier presentation, I'm voting. I earned the right to vote in 1990 when I was 18 years old, and I voted in every election in Dallas County since. In every presidential election, there's been 7. This will be number 8. I will vote in number 8. My ancestors died for me to have the right to vote. Literally, they literally gave their lives for me to be able to vote. And so I feel that it is my civic duty in order to do so, and make them proud, you know. So we can jump from 1870 and come all the way to 1920. And that entire time, everything was about voting tactics to prevent black people from voting, prevent people of color from voting. And that's why I said I don't want to just say black people. I want to say all people of color, you know, and even, you know, Hispanics, you know, whatever. To me, minorities, let's use that word, minorities, because if you were not white, you were considered a minority, regardless to your skin color. So the minorities will encompass blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asians, everybody in this country that was not white. are female. Let's go there with that as well. So from 1866, 1870 up to 1920, you had so many suffrage movements going on, but the one big thing that happened in 1920, which was 55 years after black men were given the right to vote, women were given the right to vote. And this is all women, white women, black women. It's once again, rights are relative. um, Being given the right to do something is relative. So just because women were given the right to vote did not mean that black women ran to the polls. Now, when black men were given the right to vote, and in what was it, 1867, when they actually did start voting, black men ran to the polls and they elected 22 black men to be congressmen. And that was a big thing, going from being slaves, and then just 4 years later we have 22 black men in Congress. That 4 years, we haven't made let me be quiet. I'm about to say we haven't made strides like that in a long time. But that is actually a wonderful thing. And so then, like I say, you fast forward to 1920, and now women are being given the right to vote. But once again, most often it's going to be white women, not so much minority women. You know, discrimination tactics are still in play. People are being killed trying to go and exercise their right to vote. It's to keep people in control, and unfortunately, the white male voter wanted to keep control of the country, so they wanted to do everything they could to keep minorities from voting, not shying away from killing. And we'll go from there. But it's been stressful, and to I don't want to be negative, and I'm really not trying to be. I hope it's not coming out that way. It's just to study the history of voting was really disturbing for me. And I was the right one to do it. Me being a black female, I don't shy away from anything. I have to know what happened. I have to know where I come from, how things, every step that was taken to be able to afford me the rights that I have, to be able to do the things that I do. So, you know, Black people being able to vote, the minority voting rights movement, that was one step for me as a Black person. I can't, African American is a political term that didn't come about until I was in the 7th or 8th grade. So I've always been Black in this country. So the minority voting rights movement was the first act that helped. And then the next thing, we had the women's voting right. And like I said, that encompasses all women, all races, all colors, except for Native Americans. Once again, they to this day do not have rights outside of their reservations. So it's one of those, there is so much that has gone on, and we've made so many strides, and yet we still have so far to go. But it's fine. It's fine. And once, I had to look this up because I wanted to make sure that I had the right numbers. And so I looked up, we didn't get our first Black president until President Barack Obama. That was 2008. And from there, it had been 44 elections. He was our 44th president. 44 elections, 219 years from the time that Black male slaves were freed to us electing our first Black president in this country. 219 years. So this election is also very important. Not just, people have their opinions about Trump. I'm not on that. That's not the soapbox I'm going with that. It's more of another milestone. We now have a person of color, Kamala, however you want to name her. Senator Harris is the first Black female to run for vice president, to be on the presidential ballot. And we don't know how that's going to turn out. Like I said, I'm not here. If anything, I'm loving the fact that she's female running, skin color, yay, all of that. Is just, now we have a woman of color, on the presidential ballot, not as president, but as vice president. We've had our first Black first lady with Michelle Obama. And now we're now having, and then we had Hillary Clinton run for president and lose, and that's fine. But she was on the ballot. That's a milestone as well. So I look at it that way when I'm discussing this. Not Black woman, no, I'm looking at it as these are just milestones for this country. Having a woman run for president after 200 some years, having a black lady as first lady, having a black man as president after 200 and some years, and now we have a black woman running for vice president. Wonderful. That's where I'm going with this. So after 219 years, and I did that from 2020, from 1863, or was it 1865? One of the two. But 219 years have passed, and these are now the strides that we have. And so I'm like Matthew, when the question is, why should you vote? You should vote because there is so much that has gone on for you, depending on your skin color, to keep you voting or to not let you vote. That is almost it's almost a not say a shame, but it's one of those, why wouldn't you vote? So it's go out there and make your voice known. You are on this earth. You have a purpose on this earth. Your life is here. You were born for a reason. And to me, in my opinion, one of our reasons, we have a civic duty to vote. There is so much that has gone into voting, whether you were for or against things that have gone. And I'm not on that. I'm in the middle right now with this. But for whatever reason, don't just not vote. And like Matthew said earlier, there's over 50% of the people that did not vote in the last election, and that is slated for this one as well, if not more than. You can't not vote. And so when we go there, let's talk about the Electoral College, because that's really where everything comes from. I wasn't going off on a tangent. I was going somewhere with that. So there are two types of votes that are cast in this country. There's the popular vote and there's the Electoral College vote. The popular vote is what we do. We are the ones that the popular vote. You go to the polls, cast a vote, whichever president. Like, we're voting for president, but what we're actually doing is voting for the electorates in Electoral College to cast a vote for president. So the popular vote, whichever we'll go to the polls and you'll either vote for Joe Biden or you will either vote for Donald Trump. Well, whoever leads that or wins that popular vote, all of those votes then transition over to the electoral vote. That's the Electoral College. And remember when I said earlier that the Electoral College came about because the founding fathers could not agree on how to determine who would lead this country. So Electoral College was the middleman. It's not necessarily the best, but it's unfortunately it has worked this time, and it's so hard to do away with it that we may never. Do we need to do away with it? Yes, and we'll get to that in just a second. But the Electoral College came about in 1787 at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. And it was basically based on disagreements as to how to determine who would lead this country, who would be president. And it was basically one side said the popular vote should determine everything. The other side said Congress should be the ones who would pick who the president would be. And so happy medium was the Electoral College. It is not a place. It is a thing. It's a concept. It's a method. Electoral College is not an actual live place, building, brick and mortar foundation type place. No, it is just a name for a concept. And so just a historical fact, 5 times in history, and Matthew touched on this in his previous one, 5 times in history, we have had a candidate win the popular vote, but lost the election because of the Electoral College. And we'll understand why in just a second. And so the Electoral College is basically, it's a group of people who literally vote for the president. When we vote to determine who's going to get the electoral votes for the state. And then those people then go and vote for the president. That's why it takes so long from November to January 20th, because in that time frame, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. And so the Electoral College consists of a selection of the electors who meet to vote for president and vice president, counting the electoral votes by Congress. That is basically what the process is. But you have to ask yourself, who are the electors that make up the Electoral College? And when, like I said earlier, when George Washington won, there were only 69 electors, and their votes, 35 were needed for him to win. He won all 69. Today, we have 538 electors, and it takes 270, a minimum of 270 electoral votes for any presidential candidate to win. So that's how a person can win the popular vote but lose the presidency based on electoral college, because the popular votes just say, hey, in most states, say one of them wins, they win the popular vote, and then the popular vote leads over to the electors, and in most states is winner take all. So just every state has a certain number of electors, and it's based on the census, and that's where we'll discuss this before we keep going to electoral college. Electors are determined based on the census, because every state is granted so many congressional people, senators and House of representatives and senators, based on the census. So when people yell that they don't fill out the census, and I don't, my vote doesn't count, I don't vote, I don't fill out the census, nobody cares about me. Well, the census is when it comes to election, the census is the major thing, because when you fill out the census, your body is being counted. Not necessarily your vote, but the fact that you exist and the people in your house exist. You want to be counted because you want to make sure that we have the correct number of senators and representatives in Congress representing this state. So once we do that, and then what happens is each party then determines who their electors are going to be. They call them slates. The list of electors for both parties, they're called slates. Well, that's based on that number. So and your electors are going to be political leaders, like local political leaders, or people who have been, they're known for helping one party and known for helping the other party. They're chosen by the presidential campaign and by the governors. These are people, their names, a list of names are basically given, and people are chosen to be part of the electoral college. It's basically an honor. If poli-sci is your thing, political science is your thing, and you're looking at going into government and stuff like that, being part of the electoral college, that's the game that's on the table right now. Regardless to the issues that the electoral college has, it's what we have. So you have to learn how to work within it. And so one of the best things that you can be, if working in government and political science and being a politician and all of that is your thing, one of the things you might want to opt to be is part of the electoral college. And so each candidate running for president in your state has his or her own group of electors known as a slate. That's what I was discussing. The slates are generally the slates are generally chosen by the candidate's political party in your state, but state laws vary on how the electors are selected and what the responsibilities are. Once again, every state does their own thing, so there is no one way to determine who's going to be an elector or who's going to be part of this slate. And so what happens in the general election? It says when a general election is held every 4 years, you vote for a presidential candidate. You think you're voting for a presidential candidate, but you technically are not. You are actually voting for your candidate's preferred electors. And that's what we were saying. Matthew touched on this earlier. You're voting, you think you're actually voting for the president, but you're not. You're actually voting for who's going to vote for the president. And in most states, there's a winner take all system. That means that you might have so many electors for the Democrats and so many electors for the Republicans, but if the Democrats win, they're going to get all of the elector votes. If a Republican wins, they're going to get all of the elector votes for that state. Well, what happens after that is once either party wins the general election, and win is relative at this point, then the governor of Texas, the governor of Texas, but the governor of every state will prepare what's called a certificate of ascertainment, which lists all the names of all the individuals on the slates for each candidate. And I'm reading this because I do not want to confuse any information or get anything wrong. And I hope you guys can still see me because my screen is gone black again. It has been raining and storming because of Tropical Storm Beta. So there's maybe some connectivity and buffering things going on. I apologize for that. I do not see you guys, but the last time this happened, you guys told me that you can see me. So I'm going to keep going. But so what happens is the governor prepares the certificate of ascertainment, which includes the names of all the electors on that slate for each candidate. And then whoever wins for the state, whichever party wins, they get all of those votes. And so the meeting of the electors takes place on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December after the general election. So as I was trying to understand what that meant, To me, it would just say if it's the first Monday after the second Wednesday, wouldn't that be the third Monday? But that's not necessarily true. But because it could be the second Monday, depending on the dates and how the calendar fell. So just know that the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, after the general election on November 3rd, the meeting of the electors takes place, and this is when the actual true voting for the president occurs. And so it says the electors meet in their respective states where they cast their votes for president and vice president on separate ballots. Your state's electors' votes are recorded on a certificate of vote, which is then prepared which is prepared at the meeting by the electors. So this vote, so the governor does the certificate of ascertainment. These are some really tongue twisting words. Their certificate of ascertainment, which lists all the slates. The slates are your electors. Slates, electors. That's what that is. Slate is a list of electors. What happens so the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, the electors come together. They cast their vote for president and vice president. Remember, in most states is winner take all. So if the Democrats win Texas, then all electoral votes are going to go for Texas, are going to go to Joseph Biden. If the Republicans win Texas, all electoral votes for the state of Texas are going to go for Donald Trump. Then their certificate of vote is the votes for the state. So then those votes, that certificate of vote for Texas, which means depending on who wins, all the votes are either going to be certified for Democrat or certified for Republican. That vote is then sent to Congress, and then those votes are tallied. That's how that works. And so each state's electoral votes are counted in a joint session of Congress on the 6th of January in the year following the meeting of the elections. So after the electors, the slates vote in December, those votes are then sent to Congress, and on January 6th of 2021, which applies to us. So let's go back and look at the dates. So November 3rd is election day, right? Yes. So then you have the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. So the first Monday, that's the first Wednesday, second Wednesday, the first Monday, that will be December 14th. So after November 3rd, on December 14th, the Texas state electors, or the slate, are going to come together and cast their vote. And it depends on who wins. There are only two states. Maine and Nebraska are the only two states that do not do winner take all. They have some other things going on with them. And so in the state of Texas, like I said, if the Democrats win, they're going to get all electoral votes. If the Republican wins, Donald Trump wins, then he'll get all electoral votes. Those votes then become what's called a certificate of vote. The certificate of vote is then sent to Congress. On January 6, 2021, the electoral votes are counted in a joint session in Congress, and the members of the House and the Senate meet in a House chamber to conduct the official count of electoral votes. The Vice President, as President of the Senate, so that would be VP Pence, Pence. Vice President Pence presides over the count and announces the results of the vote. The President of the Senate then declares which person, if any, has been elected President and Vice President of the United States. So November 3rd is the election, December 14th, the electoral vote, January 6th, the Congress then votes the electoral vote. And then on that day is actually when the president and vice presidents are announced, and that official announcement, because once again, on November 3rd, we'll say Joe Biden won, or, after the election or whatever, we'll say, Democrats won or Republicans won. Let's say that. I'm not going to say Joe Biden won. We'll say either Joseph Biden won or Donald Trump won. But technically, nobody knows who really won until January 6th. Anything can happen between November 3rd and January 6th. And so now we can question this. Has there ever been a time in the Electoral College vote where, like I said, if the Democrats win, it's winner take all in all states except for Maine and Nebraska? Well, what happens if one of those electoral votes does not vote for the winning party? I think there's been 5 times in the history of the electoral vote that has actually happened. And when that happens, even though the Constitution does not have, the Constitution is specific but vague, but states have rules in place about what'll happen if an elector does not vote with everybody else from their state. So say Texas has, and I'm just throwing out a number because we'll get to the numbers in a second. Let's say 10. Texas has 10. They don't. I think they have 38, something like that. But 10, nice round number. If all 10 say Democrats win, we're supposed to win, supposed to vote Democrat, or the Republicans won and all 10 were supposed to vote for Donald Trump, and say 8 voted for Trump and 2 voted for Biden, that's a problem because Texas state law says winner takes all with the electoral vote. So what will end up happening is those 2 that did not vote with the pack, they will end up being fined or something like that by the state of Texas, because what happens is, like I said, for those that are interested in political science and those type of things, you know, running for government office, being a politician is what I'm trying to say. The point is you're advocating for your party. So 10 people, winner take all. Even when you advocate for your party, you're supposed to do what's right and you're supposed to follow the law of the state. I won't say the law of the land, the law of the state. And if your law of the state says if whichever party wins, all the electoral college votes goes to that party, that's what you do. So out of those 8, if those 2 say I'm not going to do it, I'm still going to vote for the other party, that's a problem, and it becomes a problem, and it becomes a